Okay, so this is the video version of the first of three articles I've written on dealing with seemingly pointless suffering. They've all been published on my friend Tim Stratton's website at Free Thinking Ministries. I'll include a link to those in the description, so if you want to go read the full article, you can. My goal here is to try to give you, rather than the full, hyper detailed version of the article, just kind of the gist of it as I walk through this. I gave a version of this to my core group at church a couple of weeks, maybe a month ago, and when I did, it occurred to me for the first time I might well be the only person who's ever started an article or presentation with quotes from both Nietzsche and God himself, which, make of that what you will. I'm kind of a little pleased with that myself. So, to get this going, if you didn't already know my family, you wouldn't know this, but our 3 year old, well, she was 3 when I wrote this, but now she's now 4-year old daughter Eden, has inoperable and incurable brain cancer. And absent an extreme medical breakthrough or an actual miracle, she's going to have cancer the rest of her life. Now, it was a very long and difficult process even getting her diagnosed, as the cancer caused an extremely rare condition called diencephalic syndrome, or Russell syndrome. Apologies for my mispronunciation. This whole thing started a bit over 2 years ago with her simply not eating enough, not gaining weight, and eventually she started vomiting multiple times a day. We took her to various types of physical and behavioral therapy, tried all the various things they suggested, and none of it worked. There was quite some time there where I was literally pushing food into her mouth to make her eat, because if I didn't, she wouldn't eat. The poor kid was, it seemed, literally trying to starve herself to death. So eventually, as this months into this process, she was actually hospitalized for being so malnourished, and then, despite my wife and I claiming over and over again that there was some underlying problem, the doctors at the hospital just blamed me for the whole thing because I'd been forcing Eden to eat rather than letting her starve herself to death. This, they claimed, had given her a feeding aversion, and that was the problem. Now, never mind, of course, that I'd only started doing this in response to what was already a clear problem. That this hadn't happened to our other two older children, or that my wife's a well respected doctor who knows what she's talking about. No, no, no. The answer obviously had to be that my efforts to address the problem had somehow caused the very problem that I was trying to fix. See, it turns out that some medical professionals actually believe in the philosophically absurd idea of backwards causation, because that's what was apparently going on there. Now, later, months and months and months later, when the cancer was finally diagnosed, I told my wife that I now understand why some people sue hospitals. If they just bothered to listen to us in the first place, the cancer could have been diagnosed earlier. And maybe that would have done some good, maybe it wouldn't have. Eventually, when I brought that up to the oncologist who eventually diagnosed her, he said no, that probably wouldn't have made a difference. So the way she was diagnosed is that months and months after this initial hospitalization where they blamed me, we got a new pediatrician who researched what to do, as despite all the various medications that Eden was on, us using a G-tube, that's a tube that's implanted in her stomach, so we can just feed her directly, bypassing her mouth. Before that, she had a feeding tube that went in through her nose down into her stomach, and the kid hated that. But who can blame her? Who wants a tube shoved through their nose every day? Well, despite us doing all that, and I was feeding her through the G tube 7 times a day, spacing them out by like an hour or two at least every time to try to cut down on the vomiting, because she was still vomiting a lot. Well, she just wasn't improving. She was gaining weight way too slowly, and as I mentioned, the vomiting was still occurring many times a day. Well, as this was going on, my wife noticed that Eden had nystagmus, that's a constant shaking in both of her eyes, and she told her new pediatrician about it. Well, this pediatrician ordered an MRI to check for the diencephalic syndrome, as it just fit with all the problems that Eden had had and what my wife and I had been saying the whole time. It explained everything we were seeing, and before we went to get her diagnosed for the MRI, a friend of mine said, so when we're praying about this, should we pray that she has this condition or not? Do you want the answers or not? And what I told him is, oh, no, 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 no. If she has this, it's bad. Let's pray that it's not this. Well, it turned out she did have that. The MRI revealed a cancerous tumor in Eden's brain, and Eden was finally, this is after almost a year and a half, diagnosed properly. This was also the point where it seems like everything in our lives changed, because our then 4-year-old daughter now has inoperable brain cancer. The problem here is that the tumor simply cannot be strategically removed, as doing so would seriously harm key parts of Eden's brain. It would in effect probably make her a vegetable. Further, this type of cancer that she has doesn't typically respond well to treatments like chemotherapy. The treatment just lessens the effects of the diencephalic syndrome, and sometimes it will halt the growth of a cancer. We went through over a year of chemotherapy, and this is exactly what happened to Eden. Her symptoms greatly lessened. She used to throw up 4 or 5 times a day. Now she almost never throws up, and I think there was one time in like the past 4 months that she did, and it was clearly because she actually probably had a little bit of a childhood illness. She's gaining weight appropriately. She's back on the growth charts. The chemotherapy has kept the cancer from measurably growing, or at least it did for a year, but it didn't shrink either. And that seems, at least at the time when I wrote this, that was the best we could do, was hope to keep it at bay. Absent an actual miracle, the cancer's not just going away. Now, since I wrote this within the past month, we took Eden for another MRI in January, and her cancer has started growing again. January was about a year and 3 or 4 months after we concluded the chemotherapy, and it started growing again. And so they're going to put her on another medication, which we'll administer orally here at the house, and that'll need to be done twice a day. And it's still not expected to actually cure the cancer, although the oncologist did say that he's seen this sometimes shrink cancers like this, so we're hopeful that that will happen, but there's also the possibility of some severe side effects. So the point of all this is, our daughter has an inoperable and incurable brain cancer, and she's just a little girl. Now, I have been studying philosophy and Christian apologetics informally for probably about 25 years, and formally and professionally for nearly 10. I've got a master's degree in philosophy. I went to grad school for this. I've been going to conferences, at a rate of about an average of 2 a year since I graduated. Sometimes I did 3 or 4. The point is, I'm around this stuff. I study it. It's what I like to do professionally, and I talk to people who study this stuff too. And I'll tell you, if there's unjust suffering in the world, it's certainly a 4-year-old girl with incurable and unoperable brain cancer. Now, technically speaking, to claim that there's unjust suffering in the world is actually a very strong claim. It's a much stronger claim than it prima facie appears. But if anything qualifies, it's what's happening to Eden certainly does. It's entirely possible that this cancer will kill Eden long before she's an adult, and it's also possible she might survive that long. But even if she does, the tumor in her brain is simply not going away. So to avoid committing myself to a strong claim here, stronger than I have time to defend here, I just call this seemingly pointless suffering. That is, it's suffering that seems prima facie unjustified, where there's no immediate and obvious overriding good. Because, there's just obviously many examples of suffering that are good, and so are at least potentially justified. Like if you go read the written version of this, I give the example of parents who work horrible and demeaning jobs to provide their children a better life. Well, they're suffering, but they're doing something good as well, and you can see how that would work. In Eden's case, well, there might be some good that could come of this. I could point you to some examples, but it's not immediately obvious, and the things I can point you to, they don't really seem to outweigh a little girl with inoperable and incurable brain cancer. So this is the part where many other intellectual and academic people I've heard them give lectures and speak and read them talking about these kind of things, even other Christians, they usually start doing something like lamenting about how all their study, philosophy, and theology was just worthless in the face of real suffering. It's quite common for them to explain and maybe perhaps even complain about how none of it really helped them deal with their suffering and grief. But I'm just not going to do that because it's frankly just not true. At least it's not been true for me. It's actually been quite the opposite, as I'll explain more as I go through these things. Further, the experience of the last 2 or so years here has now made me quite a bit suspicious of the philosophers and theologians who make claims like that. I'd, ask them well, what exactly were you studying that proved so unhelpful when reality came to roost? If your philosophy and theology is absolutely worthless when your life gets difficult, perhaps it's a sign that you've just been doing bad philosophy and bad theology. If whatever you've been studying is that disconnected from your actual life, then I think you should probably seriously reconsider If whatever you've been studying is that seriously disconnected from your actual life, that's a sign you should seriously consider your studies. Now, of course, there are exceptions to this, but I'm quite committed to the idea that good philosophy should have a practical effect on your life, directly or indirectly. And if it doesn't, it's probably just bad philosophy akin to medieval arguments about how many angels can fit on the head of a pin. Since there are some exceptions, this is more of a guideline or rule of thumb than a strict rule, but come on. You've been studying high level philosophy or theology for 10, 20, 30, or maybe even more years. Then you experience a personal tragedy, and suddenly all that study is unhelpful or just absolutely worthless. That's a very strong indication that there was something very wrong with what you were studying. At the least, you've probably been wasting your time. If your philosophy cannot survive contact with the real world, it's probably just bad philosophy that you should throw away. Now, the problem of evil and suffering is one of the primary things that actually brought me into doing philosophy, and I'm pretty confident I've read and thought more about it than most people have. I do not mean, as I say this, that if you look around, you're not going to find philosophers who are more knowledgeable about it than I am. There are plenty of them. What I mean is, I think I've thought and studied this more than the average person who's not a philosopher has. There are definitely philosophers who are more skilled at dealing with this than I am. I went through an existential crisis in my early 20s that simply forced me to start looking into and thinking about these things. It's one of the reasons why I'm nowadays doing philosophy. So, with that said, not one time as I've considered this seemingly pointless suffering of Eden, my family, or the people who know Eden, have I thought, well, this must show that God doesn't exist, that he doesn't care, that he's not powerful enough to rip the cancer right out of her. Now, I certainly have struggles with this. I'm not okay with it or any other such nonsense like that. But I have what I think at least, are good reasons, arguments, and evidence to affirm God's existence and that God cares about us. And it's not like I wasn't aware that children get cancer prior to my own daughter being diagnosed. Now, of course, defending all those claims would be that'd be like a huge claim. I mean, 500,000 page book. Maybe if I live to my 60s or 80s, I'll write that, but I just don't have the time to write that now. I knew that there was apparently pointless suffering and evil in the world long before my own daughter got cancer. And the fact that my family and I have to deal with it in a more direct way now doesn't make any of those previous things that I believed untrue. I have had a high confidence before this that most, probably not all, but most of the trouble with evil and suffering in this world can be answered by a combination of the free will defense, soul-making theodicy, and some skeptical theism. Now, I'm sure most people who are listening to this are going to be familiar with those terms, but I'll just go ahead and quickly define them here. The free will defense, loosely speaking, is the idea that if God wants us to have genuine freedom to choose good or ill, then eventually at least some people are going to just choose ill. And thus, if we are really free, then it simply is impossible for all evil and suffering to be avoided. Now, this is considered a defense rather than a full theodicy, as it typically isn't arguing that things must be this way, simply that it's possible that things be this way, and thus we cannot say that both the existence of God and the existence of evil are true contraries. It's possible that they can go together. Now, the free will defense has been so successful that for the most part, very few, or perhaps even no, professional philosopher actually defends the logical problem of evil anymore. This actually advanced our study in philosophy of religion and pushed the problem back to where now people talk about things like the evidential problem of evil, i.e., well, okay, I can accept that there must be some evil and God must allow for some, but my word, a 4-year-old girl with inoperable brain cancer, that's just a bridge too far, and so that's where the arguments have gone now. The soul-making theodicy is the idea that God wants us to be virtuous people, and the best, and in some cases perhaps the only way to make us virtuous people is for us to endure suffering. Just as your body will not grow stronger without exercise, so your soul will not go stronger without struggle and or suffering. And I'll allude to this quite a bit more in the third one of these I do. Now, moving on to skeptical theism, it's the very common sense idea that any God worth being called God will have ideas, conceptions, and plans that are just beyond the scope of human comprehension. Hence, when something bad happens, we simply are not in a good position to say that God could not have good reasons to allow or cause that bad thing. Now, of course, there are reasonable objections to all three of these ideas, and none of them answer every single instance of evil and suffering. And even when you put all three of them together, if you were pretty clever, I bet you could come at me with a instance of evil and suffering that these three do not specifically address. I'll grant you that. But I'll also say there's some really good points behind all three of these, and I think when we take them all together, that answers most of the instances of evil and suffering, at least potentially, or at least it takes a lot of the oomph out of it, and it gives us a framework by which to deal with them. And I thought this, as I said, long before my own daughter was diagnosed with cancer, and nothing that's really happened has made me doubt the truth of those things, at least not so far. It's not like my arguments and reasons for thinking these things went away when I found out that Eden has cancer. The fact that my daughter has cancer didn't change the nature of reality, even though in many other more emotional ways it was very earth-shattering. In fact, I'll go so far as to say if your beliefs cannot survive contact with reality, even the very worst of reality, then either there's something wrong with your beliefs or there's probably something wrong with you. So when reality shatters your worldview, you need to figure out if you held wrong beliefs or if you simply lack the virtue and discipline needed to endure. It's pretty likely it's one of the two. Maybe there's a third possibility I'm not seeing there, but I'd say it's likely you lack the virtue and discipline you need, or your worldview was just wrong. You believe some frivolous and wrong things. Now, there is one point where contemporary Christian philosophy is, I think, actually very, very bad at dealing with suffering, and this is what I've termed the how-why distinction. If you read the literature on this, you'll find people using all kinds of different terms for this, but why get into complicated esoteric terms when we can just explain it how versus why pretty easily? That is, what I'm saying here is nearly all of the theodicies and other explanations for evil and suffering offered by contemporary Christian philosophers or other philosophers, they address the how question, but what we really want to know is why. Why is this particular suffering happening to me or my family, and what good will come from it? Even Nietzsche said that he who has a why can survive almost any how, and there's a very good point there. And unfortunately, this is where a lot of my fellow philosophers seem to mix and conflate these two, and this is what I mean. And even the three I just liked, they're really answering the how, not the why. So, how questions are questions of process, while why questions are questions of purpose. When I pick up a glass to take a drink, as I've been doing periodically as I'm talking here, we can talk about how that process works. There's signals my brain sends to my muscles to make the arm move. My muscles contract to move my arm. My individual cells are involved in the process, and so on and so forth. You can go all the way down to basic atomic level physics, maybe even below. But that's the how. The why is I was thirsty because my mouth is getting dry because I'm talking. Technically speaking, these are Aristotle's efficient and final or teleological causes. Now, the vast majority of theodicies and explanations for evil and suffering that are given, they answer the how, or the efficient question, not the why or the final question. Even those three I listed above, as I just said, are not really answering why, but how. None of them will tell you why this particular suffering is happening to you and what good, if any, will come from it. What we really want to know is when we are suffering is why. What is the point of all this? We want to know it's not all pointless and meaningless. We want to know that suffering isn't pointless even when it is seemingly pointless suffering. But knowing the why of suffering is at best very difficult. Good theodicies do point to the large cosmic metaphysical purposes of all suffering, but not the why of your particular suffering. It seems clear to me that in order to have grace, there must be sin, and if there is sin, there will be suffering and evil. But that's not the question I want answered. I want to know why my daughter has inoperable and incurable cancer, because this seems unfair, unreasonable, and unjust. She's a 4-year-old girl. What on earth could she have possibly done to warrant this? And how on earth could any good come from this? Now, understanding the metaphysical reality that grace can exist without sin doesn't really help me with that question. It doesn't answer that question specifically. Most of the time, we will probably never know what the purpose of our suffering is. And this is one of the points of the book of Job that I think many of us miss. And that's because we, as the reader of the story, are told most of, if not the entire reason why Job suffers. But Job never is. Read it again and watch for this. Job demands answers to why from God, and what he's asking seems to me to be very good philosophical questions that I also want answers to. They seem very reasonable. He's basically saying, this is unjust and I want to know why. And this is very reasonable, and the question not just philosophers, but most people have been asking for as long as there have been people. By all reasonable appearances, Job has been treated unjustly. But then when God shows up, he doesn't answer Job's seemingly very legitimate questions. Rather, he just tells Job who he is, who he is, that is, who God is, and who Job is. God seems to give Job a skeptical theism-style answer, essentially saying, well, who do you think you are that you could even know such things? And then Job accepts this response, or maybe rebuke from God, and then God restores his wealth and health and gives him new children. Now, we as the reader are aware of the cosmic nature of what just happened, but Job isn't. He doesn't get to know why. Now, unfortunately, the vast majority of the philosophers I've read on the problem of evil and suffering, what they do is they push the why or purpose question out, will label it something like the emotional problem of evil, then dismiss it and move on. Now, this is disastrous, as the real oomph of the problem of evil is the why or purpose questions. Absent that, it's just another logic problem that only philosophers, logicians, and maybe some esoteric theologians would care about. And for example of this, I'll point you to both Alvin Plantinga and William Lane Craig, who have both indicated things along the lines of that a person feeling doubts or overwhelming doubts about God and Christianity due to the problem of evil is in need of counseling, as theodicies have successfully answered the problem. I'll put up the quote from Alvin Plantinga here. I won't read you the whole thing. You can certainly pause and read that if you like. The point I'm striving at here is that he is pushing away the real oomph of the problem of evil, and now he's just got a logic problem that he can solve. William Lane Craig has actually said very similar things. He's argued that despite the undeniable emotional impact of the problem of evil, I'm persuaded that as a strictly rational intellectual problem, the problem of suffering does not constitute a disproof of God's existence. And then he goes on to distinguish between the intellectual and emotional problem of suffering. And in his debate with Alex Rosenberg, he went as far as saying, if the only obstacle is the logical problem of evil, hey, that obstacle's been removed. Now, what Craig and Plantinga have done here is they've bracketed out the truly difficult problems of the problem of evil and only solved the logical problem. And to be fair to them, C.S. Lewis made similar comments about this as well. And the vast majority of the time, if you're looking into any kind of philosophical problem and you find something that Craig, Plantinga, and Lewis all agree on, yeah, you should probably go with them. They're all exceptional philosophers. But this is a case where I'm arguing that they've missed the mark. The problem of evil doesn't have compelling force because it's a logic problem. It has compelling force because it is a logical problem with great existential, moral, and emotional significance. No one that I'm aware of has severe, crippling doubts about Christianity because they think modal axiom S5 is invalid, therefore ontological arguments don't work, and therefore God cannot exist. I studied modal axiom S5. I've studied ontological arguments. That's what I wrote my master's thesis on. Nobody that I've ever read suffers an existential crisis over that argument. People suffer existential crises over the problem of evil all the time. When you push that away, you're removing the real oomph and you're not actually dealing with the problem. And the reason why is there's just very little existential or emotional force behind, say, arguing about something like modal axiom S5 as a pure logic as it at least seems to be a pure logic puzzle that may have existential implications, but they're so far removed that unless you really, really study it, you're probably not going to see that. Saying that I can logically prove that a good God who is all-powerful simply must allow some evil if he wants to create truly free creatures and obtain other overriding goods like grace, well, that works. But it's kind of hard to see how it's going to help a person who's suffering with a terminal disease, who lost a spouse with an accident, who's stuck living in an active war zone, or who has a child with terminal cancer. To bracket off the experiential and emotional aspects of the problem of evil is to ignore the actual force of the problem. But I'd actually thought my fellow philosophers had mucked up this how, why, and why distinction long before my own daughter had cancer. So in many senses, this is nothing new. I'm just more convinced of it now, and I've got a practical example for it. I'd much rather my daughter didn't have cancer than I have a practical example for something I didn't already think, but there you go. So the point I'm trying to argue for here is that I think it will typically be the case that we simply do not and cannot know why we suffer. As this meme from Friends points out, it's just the case that nobody actually goes up and starts yelling, "How, God, how? How are you doing this to us?" No, we want to know why. Now, there are some exceptions to what I'm claiming here, of course. You look at Joseph's story in Genesis, and that's a great example, and I'm sure we can all point to things in our lives where we can infer, almost always after the fact, the why of the evil or suffering. For example, shortly before Eden was diagnosed, the university I was teaching at canceled the courses I was going to teach. There was an administrative snafu that led to the class cancellation, and I don't have direct evidence. It may or may not have been malicious. I don't have evidence of that at all. I really don't know. The department head and I both worked hard to try to make the class happen anyway, but it didn't work out. Then the university cut all adjuncts from that particular department. Now, at the time, this was very, very frustrating and disappointing, and I also joked with, well, given how little money they were paying me, I might have actually cost them more money to cut me than to just keep me there teaching the courses. But then it was only a month or two later that we found out about Eden's cancer, and I quickly realized the extreme amount of time it was going to take me to care for her. I'd initially thought, well, I'll apply to do some online teaching and stuff. And then as I realized, caring for my daughter is going to consume an immense amount of time, I just gave up on that because I wasn't going to have the time to properly devote to teaching the courses. Time is a finite resource, and it just would have been nearly impossible for me to both teach and care for my daughter. So there are definitely some cases where we can reasonably infer what the purpose probably was, but usually only after the fact. And so now the problem still stands, the problem of seemingly pointless suffering. If you've been alive for a significant amount of time, then you've experienced some seemingly pointless suffering. You want to know why, and you don't. The best you can do probably is offer up some speculations that may or may not be true. And if by some miracle this has not happened to you yet, like you're really young or you've lived a very isolated life, well, get ready, it's coming. So now what can we do? Well, that's what I explore in the next two parts, which I'll also record videos on and put up as well.